It's giving me like a starting event thing. There we go. We are on air. We are live with the woman, the myth, the legend, Ashley Edwards. How you doing?
I'm good. How you doing, Tony?
I can't complain. We're gonna give people a few minutes to kind of circle in here. Maybe like a minute just to circle in, and then we'll dive in. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. There it is. All right, we'll get it started. So look, everybody, thank you so much for joining. This is the third conversation in the series of Acumen America's Leadership Series, where we're working with the best and the brightest portfolio company founders that we can find in our portfolio to just really bring to light a lot of the things that are happening in our society right now. You know, obviously we're going through a pandemic that we've never seen in our lifetimes. America's having sort of a racial reckoning of sorts. And you know, our society is heading into a major election year. And when you start to think about all of those factors, it's an interesting time actually to be kind of really pushing forward on a seed funded company. So maybe we can start off a little bit by you telling a little bit about your story, where you're from, your background, and how this has kind of all led to all these events have really led towards the beginning of MindRight in that journey.
Yeah, sure, of course. Hi, everybody. Ashley Edwards, founder of MindRight Health. We're a mental health startup proudly based in Newark, New Jersey. And a little bit about us and kind of how I got here. So MindRight's whole mission is to advance health equity by making mental health care radically accessible and inclusive of communities of color and low-income families. And what we do is we provide mental health coaching over text messaging to really meet young people where they are, and it means where they feel safe and provide support. And in terms of like what brought me here, it's been a mix of professional, personal, family, all of the above. I'm happy to talk about it all, but you know, I saw the issues with mental health in my community, essentially saw how systems are failing us right now when it comes to our mental health, and wanted to do something about it. So
yeah. That's awesome. I mean, maybe that's a good starting point, right? So, you know, you have all of this social unrest going on. You have this beautiful app that's starting to kick into high gear. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing. What are you observing in these conversations? And then maybe tell us a little bit more about the product, just so that listeners have some context into your interactions with your end user.
Yeah, so the product, it's daily mental health coaching all over texting. So all a young person has to do is text us to sign up. There's no app, just text our number. They get matched with a personal team of coaches who's checking in on them 7 days a week, 365 days a year, on good and bad days, just providing support. So it's really interesting because now we're in this, we're in a pandemic, right? And so there's such an emphasis now on virtual support. And at MindRight, we were providing virtual support before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so now to see people have an increased attention on accessibility is really interesting because accessibility still mattered before COVID. And
Right.
it will continue to matter after COVID. And in our conversations with young people right now, I mean, we're really hearing everything. A lot of stress and anxiety related to school closing and city shutdowns, a lot of kids who are quarantined at home in environments where they didn't feel psychologically safe, family issues, relationship issues, financial stress, fear of eviction, all of those things come up. And then, you know, there's also stories of just amazing resilience in our communities. And so we're kind of seeing it all. I like to say we're a different type of frontline, but we're with people every day, so hearing it all.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, you know, it's interesting. Sometimes I think, particularly in impact investing, but just in general, I think it's hard for people who didn't actually live in these communities to really understand the nature of what it means to be a person of color in these low-income communities. So it would be great for you to just talk. What's a day in the life of a person who kind of like is a user of MindRight? Like, what are the different use cases? Because when I think about like just even my own upbringing and a lot of my friends, you know, when you start to think about the traumas that just from sitting in that seat, school actually becomes a big refuge for you, right? So now in the middle of a pandemic, they're forced to sit in that 24/7. So if you can like bring some descriptive kind of just examples of just how these individuals are living, that would be super helpful for our audience.
Yeah, well, what we see a lot in our communities is that, people, there's a lot of stigma around therapy. So instead of going to therapy, people are going to their basketball coach, their
Yeah,
pastor, their
yeah,
favorite teacher. And
yeah,
almost all of those sources have been cut off during the pandemic. And
yeah.
so we find a lot more people leaning into our service as a primary source of support.
Mm,
And here, just, the young people we tend to serve may have a lot of friends, may have live in a house with 10 kids and like 5 adults, but
yeah,
often don't feel safe to fully express themselves in those
yeah,
environments. There's a lot of emphasis on not appearing weak, survival mode, and so it
yeah.
limits the vulnerability that is usually necessary for emotional expression and building up emotional intelligence.
Okay.
So that's something we see a lot, and then just the whole everything that's happening. And I loved how you phrased it with the racial reckoning, because
Yeah.
again, none of this is new. We're just now really reckoning with
I'm
it.
just happy our listeners and society and capital markets and Sand Hill and really everybody in corporate America and just broadly in America, really globally, is starting to realize and listen to the things that have been said
Yeah.
for many years. So you can keep diving into that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it just reminds me, I will never forget when we first started piloting MindRight a long time ago. So like way before COVID, we were texting a girl who's living in Washington, DC, perhaps Northeast or Anacostia area. And she was going through a crisis and having suicidal thoughts. And when we were exploring that with her, she said, the reason for having those thoughts, she said, I'm poor and I'm Black, and no one cares about poor Black people. And
Hmm.
that was the driving thought behind her wanting to hurt herself. And I don't think people understand the levels of this. And
Yeah.
it's not just about DEI or
Yeah.
anything. It's about the value of our lives. So
Right. You know, it's crazy. We have been doing a lot of research in the DNI space, and I was looking at just like the doll test, right? And you go back to like that's like the 1960s, and someone did a modern version of that, and you literally had Black girls saying like they would put a Black doll and a white doll on the table, and it was like, hey, which one's bad? The Black girls pointing at the Black doll. Or hey, which baby is pretty? Oh, the white baby. And what they showed in that video is that the media does a very good job of kind of psychologically ingraining these like hierarchies, right?
yeah.
Albeit subtle. And so can you talk to us a little bit about just, so with that context, and you start to think about people who are growing up in these neighborhoods, what are some of the ways as a society we can get better at that in terms of managing those perceptions?
Yeah, I think it's just all about reinforcing positive self-identity. And it goes beyond kind of across industries, like finally addressing colorism, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
these European standards of beauty that we have. One of the things that we see a lot in conversations with Black and brown girls that we serve is just like self-esteem issues that then also translate into sexual health issues. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
we see that coming up a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up sexual health and the correlation because it's one of the questions that I had for you today was just, you're building this company, MindRight. It started as a foundation, and I'd love for you to kind of tell the journey from, nonprofit to for-profit. That is not an easy one, and we've been so impressed by the way that you've done that. But I think secondly, I think when you start to talk about who your end customer, who your end customers are in terms of who's paying, can you talk to us a little bit about how you were able to frame the health connection to emotional engagement?
Yeah. So starting with the nonprofit to for-profit.
Yeah,
So when we first started working on this, it was a 501c3, like you said,
yeah,
and that was really great for initial, like very deep on the ground community work. Like
yeah,
I spent a summer living in Southeast LA, just literally just on the ground interviewing folks, like what matters to you, how can we
yeah,
make you feel better, happier, safer, etc.
yeah,
And so that that was great and valuable experience, but it was not sustainable. And what we actually found was kind of what goes against what people usually think about the philanthropy sector, which is that we had some really great supporters, but we found overall the space we didn't see a lot of bravery in actually investing in mental health services because
yeah,
there's just so much liability that a
Yeah.
lot of people, justifiably are scared about the worst case scenarios for innovation.
Yeah.
So I decided to found MindRight Health because what I saw was this understanding among impact investors like Acumen that it is worth it to innovate in mental health and is worth it to take on those risks if we have a chance of improving the outcomes of these communities.
Absolutely.
That was a driving force. And then what was your second question?
Yeah, and actually you answered that brilliantly, because then the next question was really talking about, okay, so we believe that, right? You're able to convince investors that this is something that's worthy. Talk to us a little bit about the plans and from their perspective, because at the end of the day, they don't run charities, right? And I think the true innovation of MindRight, honestly, was that you were able to convince the plans that this was something that they should invest into. Talk to us a little bit about that.
For sure. So mental health, at the end of the day, there's a lot of research that shows that improving someone's mental health isn't just an individual benefit, but a community and system-wide benefit. And so we talk to a lot of payers, particularly Medicaid payers, and they're seeing surges in behavioral healthcare costs, specifically related to youth and young adults. And so we see that like by age 25 is usually when there's an onset of most serious mental health illnesses. Wow. And so MindRight, we're really focused on ages 13 to 25, like getting people before they hit to that point.
Yeah.
And so payers believe in us because they believe that the simple act of checking in on someone every single day and being there for them could prevent those long-term costs.
Yep. It's interesting. We see that in the geriatric populations as well. It's just called something totally different because it's social isolation, but the same kind of dynamic is true, whether it's remote patient monitoring, having care, type people coming into the homes, et cetera. So it's just interesting that you were able to pioneer that on the youth side. And the way that we usually offset that as a society is, like you mentioned, like sports leagues, dance, et cetera, particularly in low income communities. I just love that you've put a more steady kind of environment-proof solution in place. So maybe we pivot a little bit. Obviously, Ashley, you have the title of the first African American woman in the state of New Jersey to raise $1 million. So first of all, I don't know if you hear all those silent claps on the line, but talk to us a little bit about that. Like a part of this racial reckoning that we're seeing is, I feel that a lot of white Americans in positions of power are just kind of taking a step back and figuring out, how can we do more? How can we make it easier? And I think it would just be helpful to understand your journey, but like not just the fundraising journey, but also just like how you started in terms of like the schools that you've went to, the profile that you've built. And even with all of that, I'd love to know your fundraising experience, even despite all of the checks or the boxes that you've checked over the years.
Yeah, I mean, that last point, it's just, I almost have like a visceral reaction to that, because that was kind of one of the biggest pain points for me, because even starting this fundraising process, like I acknowledge that I have a certain amount of privilege. Yes, I'm a Black woman. Yes, Black women get like less than 1% of funding. At the same time, I went to Yale, I went to Stanford. I have a network that I can go to, which was kind of my first step. And so one thing that I'm wondering is, how can we make it possible for people who don't have my profile to also raise this? And I think just thinking about the barriers that I faced, like the doors that were shut in my face, like places where I still didn't have the credibility despite having like 3 degrees and like all this stuff going on, it's kind of ridiculous. So so I really just started with like Stanford connections and took it from there. And that really was a blessing. But I mean, raising that $1 million took about a year. So I think for anyone listening, this wasn't like, oh, I'm going to raise and a month or two from now, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, I get the money. No, it was a lot of rejection. Yeah.
It's interesting, man. I obviously I've been in the ecosystem for a while, and I feel it's funny. I come from a similar background as you. Like I went to Berkeley, I worked at Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and my sister calls it male Wall Street privilege, is what she tells me when I do a good job at networking. But I will say that like I want to zone in a little bit more on that, right? So like you have all these degrees, you have all this access. Talk to us about the nuances that you felt like. When did you feel like it just wasn't enough? Like what? Because like sometimes someone could hear that on the other end and think that's a little bit of hyperbole. Can you just talk to us a little bit about like some examples?
Yeah, I remember when I was first starting out, there was one funder I was talking to. They were like, "Okay, love the idea, but we want to see you get into this accelerator before we feel like you really just have started to prove yourself." Got into that
Yeah,
accelerator, came back to them, they're like, "Okay, well, actually, we think you need to have a pilot with this type of organization to get a little farther along." Came back, got that
yeah,
pilot, and then
yeah,
I was still too early. And so it's just these moving goalposts that are never good
yeah,
enough. And meanwhile, one thing I used to say is if I keeping it completely real in this conversation, I know we have a lot of listeners. I feel
yeah,
like if I
yeah,
was
yeah. This is a safe space.
if I was a white woman, Teach for America alumni, I would
Oh
have
man,
raised my round a long time ago.
yeah,
I feel
yeah,
strongly about that.
yeah. I mean, listen, man, I've seen friends, no MVP, no deck, just networks going to raise $1 million, and the reality is that like at the early stages, you can have the best financial model you can think of. You can have the best deck that you can think of. You can even have an amazing MVP. But at the end of the day, all of that stuff is going to change as soon as you go live. And what you're ultimately banking on is the person.
Yeah.
And when Acumen invested in Ashley, we were taking a long-term bet on you, that you had enough knowledge in the space, enough pedigree, enough perspective to actually go figure this thing out, get enough passion. And I think in terms of like, you made a good point in terms of like, what can we do as a society to create better pathways for people who have less privilege than you and myself. It's like, I think it's creating opportunities like this where people who are in positions of power, actually understand that there's a little bit more nuance when you're talking to a Black founder, and honestly going to places and going to sources where you can actually meet them in more organic ways. Like one thing that the thing about privilege is like it's very blind. You don't actually see it because if you're just in it, you can't tell it. So if you're going home for the weekend and you're meeting your uncle and like your uncle knows an uncle and an aunt, it feels so seamless that it's like it's nothing exclusionary. It's just life. And I think that the reality is that African Americans, by and large, in this country, definitionally, there's $5 of wealth for every $100. So if the balance of this country is ever going to shift, like there needs to be more connection points in organic ways to get to know these individuals. That's why I actually think Clubhouse was actually a really interesting app, because it's kind of facilitating this organic interaction with people who probably would have never met. But to pivot a little bit into just a little bit into in terms of like COVID, just to go a little bit deeper. From like a statistical perspective, like have you noticed like an uptick a little bit in your platform? Like can you talk to us a little bit about like the activity on the app?
Yeah, in around March, when all the schools and cities started closing, we
Yeah.
noticed it was roughly a 20% increase in engagement, like the number of
Mm.
text messages that we've been seeing. And then
Yeah.
in terms of the issues, during that time, we also saw an uptick in the amount of self-harm that was indicated in text messages, like people wanting to hurt themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. And it was crazy because simultaneously you had George Floyd, right? And we keep talking about this racial reckoning that we're going through as a society, which I think is long overdue, but I'm very happy that we're here. And, you're already starting to see positive signs from corporations, from funders, et cetera. But, talk to me on a personal level, like forget the business, forget MindRight, forget all that. As a Black woman, when you saw that video the first time, just what was going through your mind?
Um, I can't.
Yeah,
That was kind of like I can't do this. I have
yeah,
to turn off the TV, just block out everything else happening because there's no way I can fully absorb everything happening in this country and still have the mental capacity to do what I need to know I need to do as a founder.
yep, yep. And it's interesting because like I want to kind of drill in on a little bit on that because sometimes, and I myself included, I'll say I'll take that approach. It's easier to disengage from it than leaning into it because this is for every George Floyd, you can go back to when I was 10 years old, with Amadou Diallo. I don't know if you're from New Jersey, so you remember that shot 44 times. They thought his wallet was a gun. You can fast forward up to Trayvon. You can fast forward up to Alton Sterling, and for me, it was just interesting to see how America responded, because I didn't quite know what it was that was so different about this one versus the other ones, right?
Yeah.
And I'm happy that there was a shift, but the reality is I saw a lot of my friends take the posture you took, which was like just kind of like fed up, but needing to do what you have to do. So you're not alone in that, and that makes sense to me. But when you start to hear all of the commitments that are coming from corporations, from Sand Hill Road, how are you feeling about that? Do you feel like they fall on they're gonna fall flat over time? Do you feel like people are actually doing what they said they're gonna do? Is it just lip service? Is it PR? Is there a tangible opportunity here to make a difference? Like, what are your thoughts on the ecosystem?
Well, if we judge by historical attempts, they're going to fall flat and they're not going to last. If we judge based on history, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how optimistic I feel about it. I've seen a lot of posts on LinkedIn, a lot of like offers for investors to do office hours for Black founders. Send me if you're a Black founder, tweet me, like all these things.
Yeah.
And then I've also heard from Black founders who have reached out to those people and have never heard back, felt disrespected. So I think there's something just going on from a PR branding standpoint that isn't actually happening in reality, where people are actually writing checks and getting funds. So that's what's been most disappointing for me. But I do hope it's real.
Yeah, of course, man, of course. So like, obviously you just raised $1 million. I feel like founders have two jobs: to grow the business and fundraise. So you're never actually not fundraising. Talk to us a little bit about the conversations that you're currently having now. Are you at least seeing positive upticks in those conversations in your own personal interactions outside of the systemic piece?
Yeah, I am now. So it's really interesting. So the 1 million I raised literally had to like fight blood, sweat, and tears for that money. And now that the Forbes announcement came out about my raise, I now have inbound messages from investors, which is a much different than what I was experiencing. So I'm feeling really positive about being able to bring on the right people, because I think now I have the luxury of really being able to figure out the partners that are directly aligned with our mission and values, like Acumen. Because I think that's one thing.
Oh, we lost Ashley. You guys do not want to see me. Just a second, everybody. Oh, there you go.
Sorry.
I was like, man, they do not want to see my ugly face for the next 30 minutes. We gotta bring the star of the hour back. Come on. Saw a black man turn red just now.
My bad. I just ghosted you by accident. So yeah, what I was saying before I touched my computer in a really weird way. A lot of Black founders who are just really hungry for funding sometimes end up getting into taking money from people who aren't the best people for them long term, and I'm glad I did not fall into that. So yeah, excited for the future.
Awesome. So maybe this is a good segue, and just to talk to us a little bit deeper about the long-term vision for MindRight. Where do you see it going? How does that tie into the current product? What do you need the funding for? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so long term, I want everyone to have access to MindRight, starting with young people, eventually extending the age to people like us and older. I see MindRight as really being baked into your health insurance plan and your benefits. Same way you have medical dental, you get text from your MindRight coach if you choose to. And so that's a big part of our strategy that we're working on right now, like a healthcare reimbursement strategy. What does it look like for us to work with payers? So really, really excited for all of that.
That's amazing. And so from your perspective, what do you think is needed in the system? Because obviously MindRight's just one cog in this broader wheel of mental health services, particularly in terms of youth. But from a trauma perspective, how do we make this a better experience in the United States for these kids? You have so much data on your hands in terms of the day-to-day intricacies. We would love to hear from you in terms of what do you think is actually necessary for systemic change?
Yeah, I think we need to take a step back from the current system and actually allow for a redefining of what healing means, especially for people of color. Right now, when we look at existing clinical interventions, it's very, very westernized. A lot of times doesn't honor the lived or cultural experiences, ancestral traditions of Black and Brown communities in the US. And there's so much money spent right now trying to push people into high cost, sometimes not always effective, like clinical interventions. And a lot of times they're needed. But I think there's so much, what if we spend all those resources on actually meeting people where they are?
Yep.
And so I think there's this whole world of non-clinical support that we could be thinking about. If we know like a teenager living in Newark, New Jersey is not going to willingly sign up to see a therapist, but they're going to talk to their coach or whoever. Why are we not doing more work with basketball coaches to help them be trauma informed in their practice and their coaching and their discipline? Like, we need to meet people where they are. And so that's something that I wish we would, I mean, there's just so much regulation and policy work that needs to get done to fully address that on the systems level. But it's where MindRight fits in, just acknowledging like we, instead of making people move to us, we need to move to them.
Right. And catch them exactly where they are and meet them on their front doorstep. I think from my perspective, for what it's worth, it's when I look at a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with in these low income communities, you have, cops who are dealing in tough neighborhoods. You have kids who are growing up in tough neighborhoods. And it really ultimately feels, if you take like 3 steps back and you helicopter up, it feels like there's a systems issue going on, and from a demand side perspective. So you talk about a lot of things that in my mind, I'm like, federal intervention, to over-resource these communities seems as if it's something that can help. Do you think that that's possible? Obviously, you don't view yourself as a social determinants of health company, but do you feel like there is a way, even whether it's through our healthcare system, to really address all of these traumas and the things that are driving them? Or do you think that it's healthcare is not enough? It actually has to be a step above in terms of the DOJ, in terms of the Department of Education. Like, how do you, Department of Education, right?
Yeah, I mean, we need one, more funding, and number 2, a reallocation of funds. And it goes back to the defund the police conversation, where the ask is really to move some of that money to having more social workers in schools.
Right.
And so I think that is something that should be an easy thing to fix. I think that's one good example there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you even have cops showing up to, situations that are really mental health outbursts, right? And I think that if you think about the training that it takes for someone to respond to a 5150 or a 5051 complaint or request, it takes technical training to subdue, understand, and de-escalate a situation, even on the mental health side. So I couldn't agree with you more there. So where do we go from here as a society? Where do we go from here?
As a society, I mean, we need to prioritize our individual and our collective healing right now. So each of us within our families and ourselves, like figuring out what it is we're doing to make sure that we don't go crazy right now. Like, how are we preserving our joy? And then I think the healthcare system, COVID-19, if one positive thing comes out of it on the healthcare side, again, it's forcing people to realize you have to be accessible. You have to provide these waivers for virtual support for interventions. You have to, make it easy for people to get the help they need. And I mean, during COVID, we discovered that it's possible for the U.S. to provide stimulus checks to all of its residents.
Out of nowhere.
Things about the potential of our country to help its citizens. So I think that's a good starting point.
Absolutely. So what are the so let's talk a little bit about your end buyers. Like, are they just health plans, or do you sell into other organizations?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of interest from schools as well. So there's a couple schools where we're working with a select number of their students. And we've had schools who are just like in like urgent need of mental health support for their students. They really, a lot of school leaders really have no idea how their students are feeling right now, because they're not coming into school. They're at home. Sometimes they're sharing computers with their siblings. Sometimes they lose Wi-Fi. I was talking to a school leader where he said at the beginning of the school year, they had, I think it was like this was last school year, they had over 90% engagement in online learning. And by the end of this past school year, it dropped down to less than 20% of kids were engaged in their classes. So it's crazy.
That's intense. So okay. So, when you think about this product over the next 2 to 3 years, and you start to think about all the things that are changing in society, like where is MindRight going to be? Like in terms of, is it just mass adoption amongst, the youth, or do you transition out of that population? And like, talk to us a little bit about like the expansion of the enterprise of MindRight Health.
Yeah, I see it as mass adoption in that among these communities and that target age group first, because I think the intergenerational trauma and all the system failures are just so compounded that it's going to take some time for us to, tap into that and make a strong difference and reverse some of those outcomes.
Yeah.
But for sure, I think beyond that, would love to expand it to adults. We know, like I said, intergenerational trauma. So if you have trauma, it's likely someone in your family has trauma, and like it's just a buildup. So we want to support parents as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So as a Black female founder, you still are running a business, right? And when you start to think about diversity, how do you think about how you build your team out, right? So we always look at how in the early days of companies, people are hiring friends, and then suddenly you look up and it's a very homogenous group. As a minority, can you talk to us a little bit about the tension of building a team as an African American woman?
Yeah, I mean, we were created and designed to serve people of color and low-income families, and I'm proud to say we are a people of color-led company. I actually had a meeting with an investor several months ago, and she was like, I've never seen the diversity on a leadership team that I've seen at your company. Like, I've never seen it. And so it's something that we feel really proud of. And it also goes back to, sometimes I get a question from people like, oh, why didn't you stay in Palo Alto at Stanford? That's a perfect place to grow a company. If I was growing a company to serve Palo Alto residents, it would be an amazing place to start a company, but I'm not. And so I think being super grounded as a founder and what you were created for, that made the decisions much easier.
Yeah, for sure. So you opened up a little avenue for me here. So tell me your why. What's your why?
My why is, when I was going through some of my personal, most difficult mental health challenges with depression, when I was working in education here at a high school in Newark, New Jersey, the people who helped me the most to heal and recover from that experience were my students. And they're the same students that society will tell you will end up in prison, will have, all these horrible outcomes, just negative narratives. And they saved me to an extent in that period of my life. And so I feel an obligation to move past that forward to other people.
Yeah, it had to be frustrating as a teacher sometimes in these environments, like in the sense of, as a society, everything you just said, we know exactly how statistically what will happen in some of these communities. They talk about the infamous school to prison pipeline. As an operator, I know this is like maybe a little bit off tail from MindRight, but as an operator of a school, when you're facing those types of tasks, how do people in schools navigate that?
I mean, this question is the reason why most people working in schools and neighborhoods like this have secondary trauma themselves. Because there's not really support. You're just in environments where you have to, be someone's grief counselor, their support system, et cetera. There is no one else. So it's just a very heavy feeling.
And we've talked about this off air, but one of my mentors is Bill Milliken from the Communities and Schools. And what I've loved about their model is the fact that, obviously it's philanthropically funded, but they basically created that on-site coordinator, right? Where that person basically becomes the handler of all of that trauma versus the teachers. Do you feel like that model is enough? Do you think there's another step that the Department of Education can take across public schools to really kind of offset that or enhance it? Do you think that that's necessary? Because it feels as if teachers are focused 100% on everything else, that the education kind of falls to the wayside a little bit.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's a really great step. And I just think there needs to be more people like that, more coordinators. I mean, in the school I worked at, we had one part-time social worker for about 300 kids, which was
Yeah.
actually one of the best ratios you'll see in an urban school district. But
Yeah.
that one social worker has about 20 kids, maybe 30 on their caseload, and they don't have capacity to help
Yeah.
anyone else.
Yeah.
And so you find that so many young people's mental health needs just don't get met.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you had a magic wand, Ashley, if you had a magic wand and you can recreate the experience of low income users of your platform, what would you use that magic wand to do?
Oh, wow. Wow.
There's no constraints. No budgetary constraints, no political constraints. We live like, what would you do? What does it look like?
I would want, this is an intangible thing, but I want them all to feel safe.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about physically and psychologically, because without that, there is no room to do school, do work, careers. I mean, literally, like when you're living in poverty and you're
Yeah.
exposed to food deserts and community violence, all that stuff, like it's
Hard.
about, yeah, it's survival. Like you don't have the luxury of getting to a point where you're thinking about like self-actualization. Like, what is that? No,
Right.
I'm thinking
Right.
about today, how I move from today. So I just want them, I want them to have that benefit of time and
safety. Yeah. It feels like sometimes the best answers to the most complex problems are so simple, and you because there's a lot of downstream effects towards what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely agree there. So thinking like to pivot back to like just school a little bit, business school. Obviously you are highly employable. Absent of MindRight. Talk to us a little bit about that transition and think about it from a lens of you don't come from wealth per se. You don't have a monster safety net. Like talk to us a little bit about, unless you hit the lotto and you do, or if I'm wrong, I apologize. But like talk to us a little bit about that decision. That decision to say, you know what, I'm putting 2 feet in the ground. I'm quitting my job, or I'm transitioning from school and going straight into this, and this is my calling, and I don't care what anyone has to say. What were the signals that you knew it was the right time, and what type of fears did you have in your head given your background?
Yeah. Well, one, I think you have someone told me, or I was at a talk and someone said you have to be a bit self-obsessed and crazy to be a founder. Like just believe so crazy in this dream.
Oh, trust me, I know.
Yeah, I know you
gotta be a nut.
You gotta be a nut. So I think for me, it was just after this experience, the experience I worked in this when I was in the school system.
Yep.
Every day saw the system failing, not only me personally, but my students, just failing everyone. And a lot of people say like I was inspired to do work next week. I was pissed. I was angry. I was in a complete rage. And I was like, this cannot be. And literally that anger fueled me. And I was like, I cannot do anything else because I am offended by the status quo right now.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. Oh man. I mean, like, look, that's real. It was like a labor of pain. It's interesting. So many different founders have so many different pathways into their ultimate vision, and as long as you have something to hold on to, when the days get hard, it seems as if it's a good model. So what are some of the hardest things you've experienced? Just like talk to us a little bit about being an entrepreneur. What's hard about it? What do you love about it? Obviously we know why you won't ever quit.
Yeah.
Especially you hear that seed investors and Series A investors, she will never quit ever. But tell us a little bit about the hard parts of being a founder.
Yeah, hard parts. Sometimes I feel like a single parent providing for a family. You gotta make every month, gotta find a way to make end meet for your team members.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, what's hard and which is also something I'm really proud of, again, like my team members reflect the communities that we serve. So my team members don't come from money.
Yeah.
And so it's really important for me to put them in a position where I can compensate them fairly and their worth. And, health insurance benefits, like that is something that I take a lot of pride in being able to offer. And then I think specific to MindRight, it can be really heavy holding these, difficult experiences that kids are telling you every day, and just kind of hearing their stories. But then at the same time, a lot of energy, because I have my team, we have this straight window into how incredibly resilient and strong and amazing and undefeated our communities are, which I don't think everyone has access to. So that helps to keep me going in those times.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I thought the 1619 project was a beautiful project that was put together, and we have a just for everyone on the line, we have a weekly meeting where we give context into things that are going on in the world, and this topic came up, and the thing that stood out to me from the 1619 project really hits on what you said, which is Black resilience is really the foundation in terms of civil rights in this country across everything, whether it's gay rights, whether it's immigration rights, whether it's anything, that resilience is there. And it's interesting. And the last thing I'll say before Eliza can jump in is that, one of my friends is running a really awesome accelerator, particularly focused on minorities. And what he said, particularly about Black women, what triggered me to say this was when you talked about just like you feel like a single mother just scrapping to feed your family. He said that what he noticed amongst his cohort for Black female entrepreneurs versus any other cohort was that, right? It was that resilience, that scrappiness, that I got to make ends meet. No one's going to give me anything. So the last thing I want to say is, can you talk to us a little bit about that psyche of just that scrappiness and being a Black woman and Black woman magic, and then we'll hand it off to Eliza.
Yeah, it's kind of like the feeling, which I'm not a parent, but maybe parents have this, where all your kids know is that there's going to be gifts under the Christmas tree. They don't know how they get there. You don't know how they're going to get there, but you know it's going to happen. You're going to find a way. And that's how I feel with making payroll.
There you go.
Like,
there you
they don't
go.
have to worry about it. They don't even know there's any concerns about it because they're good. They're taken care of. And they're like, my team, we say we're a family, a community. That's something I take, really seriously. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Ashley, I am deeply impressed by you. I am inspired by you. I think the world of you and your company, just like Acumen does. Thank you for the time. I'm going to acquiesce now to Eliza, but I'm always a phone call away, and hopefully, by the end of this, we have some calls to action just to see, what is important to you and what you need from our community. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tony.
Eliza, it's on you.
Thanks, Tony. And this is, it's always hard for the question facilitator from the audience to break into these conversations. It's so great hearing your voice, Ashley. And, we've got a good list of questions from the audience who are deeply engaged. And, I think as impressed as we are with you, as we always are. So I will launch into a few of those, see if we can satiate some of the curiosity that's overflowing here. A couple, it's a range of some more technical things around MindRight itself, and then some big picture stuff as well. So maybe just a couple of more technical things about how you work and how you work with students or with youth and communities. For some questions around how do you talk to skeptics about sort of like the potential of using text as a really powerful intervention here, compared to sort of in-person mentoring programs. How do you build those questions both with partners, investors, and
Yeah, that reminds me of kind of one of my first conversations with a school principal. She was like, I do not believe students are going to text you. They're just not going to do it. I was like, well, can you bring a student in here? I like to just pitch MindRight to them and hear what they say. Students fell in love, principal was stunned, and then we signed that contract. So I think it's just about taking a seat back and understanding in our place, we're not necessarily the target market of MindRight, and understanding that and allowing youth to lead the decisions.
Yeah. I love that example. How do your team of coaches, there is something about in-person establishing trust. So what are some of the methods that your team uses to do that over text and to really sort of establish those trust-based relationships that allow youth to open up to you and get the support they need?
Yeah, so two key methods for building trust. So one, eliminating all power dynamics if possible, and then two goes to the accessibility. So with the power dynamics, this is not therapy. This is not something people are forced to do. They opt in, number one. And number two, unlike a traditional like therapy session, it's not the coach just asking you questions without sharing anything about themselves. Our coaches share their personality. The young people can ask them questions back. It's very equal, and you're not forced to talk about anything you want. And then the way you build trust over time, this is why we were developed as a 7-day-a-week, 365-day-a-year intervention. We don't expect you to give us your trust after day one or even month one or even month 3. We know how most of the youth that we serve have been historically abandoned by adults. And so earning their trust is a privilege. And so someone may just text us a couple times this week, but a couple months from now, they're telling us their whole life story, and we give them room to have the time that feels right for them.
Yeah. What have you seen? I know, there's been, of course, there's always challenges and there's always hard parts of building an early stage business. What have you seen that's been really sort of surprising, either with the youth you're working with or, something you didn't expect in a positive way, either what they sort of, how they've helped shape, what you're building, if that's the case at all, or any sort of positive along the way in the last couple of years?
Yeah, this was even surprising for me, like being the founder, but the texting, like new texting would be a way that young people would be able to feel comfortable speaking. But we literally have young people who are texting us essays, like multiple paragraphs. And I'm like, how are you even doing that on your phones? You're just typing all of this. And so I think even the extent of engagement that we're actually seeing over texting was a surprise to us when we first started. And I would say also the different conversations that are coming up. Thought this would be, when we started, it would be really focused mental health conversations. And for a lot of the young people we serve, mental health is intertwined with conversations about their breakups, arguments with parents. And so we get a lot of that stuff. And I think that was just, something that we've gotten used to and was initially surprising.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that, as we were sort of learning about your model and figuring out where, how we think about the theory of change you're doing, something that was really compelling to this, you're providing is there not only to deal with the challenges that are coming up, but a stable and reliable voice to celebrate things that go well. Like the critical part of, the critical part of the trust building, but the part of building like a real meaningful relationship. And so love to hear like those essay long texts. It's working. What about, let's see, there's so many good questions. When you do have a youth that you're communicating with, your coaches communicating with, who clearly does need more sort of mental health services, what's the process there? How do you connect them? How do you continue to work with them if they need to be sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our coaches, as they're supporting our members, they're all supervised by licensed clinicians. And those clinicians are watching every incoming, outgoing message, providing support on how to respond. And if we do detect a member in crisis, that's when the licensed clinician steps in to de-escalate, stabilize them, and then connect them to an emergency resource, whether that's a local mobile crisis, national suicide hotline. And then we still are texting them every day, so before, during, and after crisis.
Great. Awesome. Okay, now we might get into some of the bigger picture, out of the nuts and bolts for you. How do you, this is a question from one of our listeners, I believe, in New York. How do you envision bridging MindRight preventative community-driven work with the current highly professionalized and regulated landscape? And are there needs to increase sort of diversity in the practitioners to make sure we have culturally informed care at different levels coming together? Sort of how do we move the system, I guess is the question, really, from something that's been really formal, really highly regulated to something that you're saying is so really adapting to what's needed and meeting people where they are. The big one.
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially the grunt of the work that our team is focused on right now, especially during COVID. I was a part of a behavioral health recovery task force for Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield in New Jersey. And the key question they had was, how can we make room for more services like MindRight, acknowledging that right now, to partner with these payers, it's really these really highly professionalized clinical interventions. And so I think a lot of payers are figuring out, where do non-clinical like peer or community health worker models fit in, and how can we make room for them? And so we find that for those type of payers, MindRight checks the box for not only just like community or peer level support, but culturally responsive services. And now there's kind of a fire lit under a lot of these payers that they need to have more culturally responsive practitioners and services. So I'm hoping that there's going to be more movement there.
Yeah, great. How do your I know I've taken a little bit of this, the benefit of the phone. How do conversations, how did the process with payers go in terms of how you integrate with potentially like a nationwide payer plan? Does it start at that level, or do you have to start really small, or how does it work? And basically, what needs to change in those sorts of processes to make them more flexible and adaptive solutions like MindRight?
Yeah, with those type of partnerships right now, like we're looking for payers who are able to conduct like small targeted pilots with us. So whether if it's a few hundred or a few thousand members at a time, so that we can really understand how MindRight impacts those members' long-term outcomes and costs for payers. And that's data that we're really excited to get. So I think just narrowing it on one market, one state, even maybe one city to start, and then taking it from there.
Great. Well, what are the more audience questions here? What are some of the biases and misconceptions? And you addressed this a little bit with Tony, but what are some of the biases and misconceptions you think are most detrimental to improving lives of at-risk youth, low-income youth, and communities of color in the U.S.? But that's things that are influencing policy, payer policy, school practices in terms of how they support students. Are there specific biases, misconceptions that we really need to be aggressively tackling, or are they sort of some of the things we've already been talking about over the course of the hour?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just emphasize again, more funding and focus on like peer level services that really meet our communities where they are. There's a lot of data showing the effectiveness of community level interventions, but they're still not properly funded. And then I think on a larger level, just the narrative behind low income communities and youth, and how can we make that more strengths-based and approach interventions from the strengths-based mindset, which is part of why, our focus is not crisis, it's every day. And I think we see a lot of backing on crisis emergency services, as there should be, but I think like just preventative services and upstream services are not funded as well. And there's a lot of room for growth there. Great.
A lot of people reacted strongly to loving the way you're speaking about sort of redefining healing and the need for that. Is that becoming an easier conversation to have both with partners and investors, or are we still sort of just starting that process of shifting mindsets there?
We are just starting that process. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Fair. What are some of the, if there are any that you would specifically call out, what are there's mindset change, there's a lot that needs to happen, obviously. Are there particular barriers with the way the current system is structured in terms of reimbursement, is it policy, that are barriers to your growth and greater of making MindRight accessible?
Yeah, so right now we're working on a reimbursement strategy, and there is no straight even guideline on how a service like MindRight can get reimbursed. There's just so much gray area. And so I even think it'd be one thing if we're able to move forward and just we're hitting rejection or no, but it's not even clear in the system how innovative models can even get through for reimbursement. And so I think making the systems and the processes much more transparent, for one. And then I think one question mark right now that we have is, with COVID-19, there's the emergence of a lot of waivers for telehealth, but the future is still quite uncertain. And so we don't know how it's going to play out. Hopefully some of those waivers will stay, but we don't know for sure.
Are there ways that, folks like you who are kind of innovating on the front lines are able to inform conversations around this? Or do you feel like it's really a black box and you're just kind of waiting to see how things shake out?
Man, I wish there was. I don't know how to get access to those conversations, but yeah, if there's any like policymakers listening in or people at CMS like who are making these decisions, I think especially there's a disconnect with founders of color who are doing this work. Because, we are the experts in the communities that we serve, but a lot of times the funding, the bills that are being passed don't actually go to support the type of work that we're doing.
Yep. So, I mean, I love hearing from you. There's so much good stuff that you're all working on, and we invested in you because we believe MindRight needs to be in the world, and we want to help bring MindRight to as many views as possible. There's a lot of heaviness in the world. There's a lot of challenge. What you're tackling every day is often challenging and emotionally, heavy as you try and give this support to so many youth who need it. What gives you hope, and like what keeps your fire burning and makes you optimistic for the future?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to the young people that we serve. Like I was mentioning to Tony the other day, our youth are undefeated. Like they're still standing, they're still here with all the trauma, all the challenges, all the barriers to just success and joy and jobs. And so I get really excited every day when I get to interact and text and hear from young people who are still smiling and finding ways to stay strong, and that gives me a lot of joy too.
Amazing. Yeah, we need that level of resilience and sort of inspiration these days, and it's great to hear that, from the corners where you're seeing that. It's really encouraging, and I hope we do have policymakers on the phone, or folks who connect the policymakers on the phone, and we can try, collectively. I think that's the goal that we as investors help support is like, let's connect these dots, have such powerful innovation happening in communities led by leaders too, and we need the system quickly to bring that to fruition for more people who need it. So thank you so much for your time today, Ashley. Always incredible to hear from you, and I'm just so glad we to let others hear your voice today as well. I just want to quickly, for everyone who's listening, give some thanks for tuning into this. This was the fourth and final conversation of our leadership series on tackling racism and poverty in the U.S. And I want to thank Acumen America's partners who make our work possible and make it possible for us to support entrepreneurs like Ashley and Eric and Abby from Isusu and Irma from Bitwise, we've also heard from. So quick thank yous to RWJF, Method Foundation, Barclays Autodesk, Valio, Johnson & Johnson, and Capital One, among others. They're, huge anchors of our work and a lot. So thank you for that. But most of all, very thanks to our entrepreneurs, the others who appeared in this series, and all of the others in our portfolio who are doing the hard work every day, in companies that are trying to really change systems in this country to tackle the entrenched poverty, issues of poverty and racism, and really change the trajectory of a lot of individuals in this country. So I know I learn a ton every day from the leadership of our entrepreneurs, and our goal with the series was to really just elevate your voices and allow others to hear you as well. And we're really proud to be part of the journey with you all this year as you're working tirelessly to build a more equitable and just society here in the U.S. So Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, all of our entrepreneurs, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
All right.
They hate when I do this, but namaste. Okay, bye, Ashley.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.